Office Games: Power, Loyalty, and Survival Inside Modern Organizations. Written by Aaron Kairos. Narrated by Arlen Vale. Preface: read this before you try to be professional. Most people enter workplaces and organizations believing they are stepping into systems governed by merit, clear rules, and rational decision-making. When they encounter favoritism, silence, shifting standards, or outcomes that make no sense on paper, they assume something has gone wrong. They tell themselves that bad actors must have taken over, that leadership has failed, or that the culture is somehow broken. What they are usually seeing, however, is not a malfunction. It is the normal behavior of any large human system under pressure. When enough money, reputation, hierarchy, and risk are concentrated in one place, survival quietly begins to outweigh fairness. Risk management displaces transparency, and control of uncertainty takes precedence over stated values. If you have ever felt confused by why the most competent person was ignored, why the most honest voice was sidelined, or why those who caused problems were protected while those who fixed them burned out, the confusion was not a personal failing. If you have ever wondered why saying the right thing at the wrong time did more damage than saying nothing at all, you were not misunderstanding the rules. You were operating under the wrong model of the game. Organizations do not run on what they claim to value. They run on what keeps them stable. And stability is maintained not through truth, but through alignment, narrative, and the containment of risk. This book is not written for people who want to become ruthless, deceptive, or politically aggressive. It is also not written for those who believe that pretending politics do not exist will somehow make them disappear. Both positions are forms of surrender. One surrenders to corruption, the other surrenders to naivete. What this book offers instead is something far more useful: the ability to see the invisible machinery that shapes outcomes long before performance reviews, meetings, or promotions ever take place. You will not find instructions here for manipulating coworkers or playing dirty. What you will find is an explanation of how power actually moves inside organizations. You will learn how narratives are formed and defended, how pressure is applied and gradually normalized, how loyalty is manufactured, and how people become expendable not because they are wrong, but because they become inconvenient to the structure. Once these patterns are visible, they lose their ability to shock you, and losing their power to shock is the first step toward losing their power to control you. At its core, this book is about staying intact inside systems that quietly reward compliance and punish clarity. It is about learning how to work, lead, and survive without surrendering your sense of self or your future to games you never agreed to play. If something in your professional life has felt off, heavy, or strangely unfair, that discomfort is not a weakness. It is an early signal. It means you are brushing up against forces that have names, shapes, and rules, even if no one ever taught them to you. By the time you reach the final pages, you will not be immune to office politics. No one is. But you will be oriented. And in environments where power hides behind politeness, orientation is the difference between being used and choosing how you move. Part 1. The Reality of Work. Chapter 1. Work is not what you were told. Most people enter working life carrying a quiet but powerful assumption. It is rarely articulated, yet it governs expectations, behavior, and self-judgment for years. The assumption is simple: effort will be noticed, competence will be rewarded, and doing one's job well will over time translate into security, advancement, and respect. This belief is not naive. It is taught deliberately. It is reinforced by schools that reward compliance and output, by corporate language that equates performance with virtue, and by cultural stories that present work as a moral proving ground. It is how institutions recruit energy without having to explain the real terms of exchange. You are invited into a story in which work is a ladder, merit is the rungs, and steady climbing guarantees upward movement. That story is not entirely false, but it is dangerously incomplete. In reality, organizations are not designed to maximize fairness, truth, or even productivity. They are designed to preserve themselves. They are systems whose primary objective is continuity. Budgets must be justified year after year. Hierarchies must be maintained to coordinate authority. Internal stability must be protected against external pressure and internal disruption alike. Everything else, innovation, efficiency, performance, even talent, is subordinate to that overriding goal. Work takes place inside this larger logic, not alongside it. Once you see this, many of the quiet contradictions of office life stop feeling mysterious and start appearing inevitable. This is why people who produce the most are often the most exposed. Production creates dependency. Dependency creates leverage. Leverage attracts attention. In a system that is constantly managing risk, attention is not a gift. It is exposure. The more visible your contribution becomes, the easier it is to attach outcomes to your name, both positive and negative. And in organizational life, blame carries far more weight than credit. Credit flatters and circulates. Blame isolates and removes. When budgets tighten, leadership changes, or a project collapses, it is rarely the least useful who are pushed out. It is the most convenient. The person whose name can absorb the impact with the least collateral damage to the system. The language of work exists largely to conceal this reality. Words like team, culture, and alignment are not meaningless, but they are not what they appear to be. They function less as descriptions and more as instruments. They coordinate behavior. They suppress open conflict. They encourage individuals to internalize organizational priorities as personal values. A workplace is not a family, even if it repeatedly calls itself one. Families are bound by obligation that survives failure. Organizations are bound by utility and risk. They resemble small political states far more than communities of shared interest. They have factions, power centers, protected groups, and expendable populations. You may be told that everyone is on the same side, but incentives are never evenly distributed, and neither is danger. This is why simply doing your job is insufficient as a survival strategy. A job description outlines tasks. It does not define position. Position is where you sit within a web of relationships, dependencies, narratives, and protections that actually determine outcomes. Two people can perform identical work, deliver similar results, and occupy entirely different political realities inside the same organization. One will be shielded, supported, and forgiven. The other will be scrutinized, pressured, and blamed. The difference is not competence, it is placement. Most people are never taught to see this distinction. They are trained to focus on output while ignoring context, to believe that professionalism means neutrality, and to treat politics as something corrosive that exists elsewhere. But politics is not a pathology. It is simply the distribution of power, protection, and consequence. Wherever humans organize around shared resources, politics emerges. The office is no exception. In fact, it is one of the most refined political environments most people will ever inhabit, precisely because livelihoods, status, identity, and future opportunity are constantly at stake. This is why workplaces feel emotionally intense in ways that often seem disproportionate to the actual work being done. Meetings feel charged even when nothing important is said. Emails feel loaded even when the language is polite. Silence feels ominous. Praise feels temporary. Criticism feels dangerous. These reactions are not signs of irrationality or fragility. They are rational responses to an environment where survival is mediated through perception and narrative. The workplace is not merely a site of production. It is a site of ongoing evaluation. Rent, healthcare, social standing, and future mobility all pass through it. And the nervous system understands this, even when the mind insists that it is just a job. The myth of meritocracy makes this environment harder to navigate because it moralizes outcomes. It tells you that success reflects worth and that failure reveals deficiency. This framing is comforting to institutions because it removes the need for explanation. When someone is promoted, the story is excellence. When someone is dismissed, the story is inadequacy. In both cases, the deeper mechanics, risk management, political trade-offs, narrative convenience, disappear behind a moral explanation. Responsibility is individualized. The system remains unexamined. Once this becomes visible, it explains a familiar but rarely articulated phenomenon. Offices filled with high performers who feel anxious, confused, or quietly betrayed. They did what they were told. They worked hard, they stayed late, they met targets, they demonstrated commitment. And yet they find themselves blocked, sidelined, or suddenly disposable. The problem is not that they failed to perform. The problem is that performance alone does not grant safety inside a political system. Safety is conferred, not earned. It flows through relationships, narratives, and perceived risk, not through effort alone. This book is written for people who have felt that disconnect but lacked language for it. It does not tell you to become cynical or disengaged. It does not argue against caring about your work. It asks you to stop confusing labor with leverage and effort with protection. The modern workplace is not a ladder that rewards climbing. It is a field of shifting incentives, alliances, and vulnerabilities. To survive within it, you must understand the terrain as it actually operates, not as it was promised to you. Only then can you begin to move with intention rather than hope. And that is where real agency begins. Chapter 2: The Invisible Game. Every workplace operates through two systems at the same time, whether it acknowledges this or not. One system is visible, documented, and officially endorsed. The other is informal, largely unspoken, and far more decisive. Most people are trained to see only the first, while their careers are quietly shaped by the second. The official system is easy to recognize. It consists of job titles, reporting lines, performance metrics, project plans, and carefully worded statements about culture and values. This is the system presented during onboarding, reinforced through policy documents, and referenced whenever legitimacy is required. It is orderly, legible, and reassuring. It suggests that work proceeds through rational processes and that outcomes follow from clearly defined rules. Running alongside it is the invisible system. This system is built out of influence, reputation, alliances, fear, memory, and narrative. It has no formal documentation, no organizational chart, and no explicit rules. Yet it determines what is funded, whose mistakes are forgiven, which projects survive, and which people advance or disappear. It is not taught, but it is learned. And it is this system, not the official one, that ultimately governs outcomes. Most people spend their working lives trying to master the visible system while being quietly constrained, redirected, or penalized by the invisible one. They focus on improving performance, refining skills, and meeting expectations, often without realizing that these efforts are being interpreted through a second lens entirely. The result is confusion. Effort does not always lead where it should. Competence does not guarantee safety. Rational decisions produce irrational consequences. From the inside, this feels disorienting. From the perspective of the invisible system, it is entirely coherent. The invisible game begins with a simple structural fact. No one inside an organization has complete information, and everyone is exposed to risk. Leaders do not know which initiatives will succeed. Managers do not know which teams will be cut, merged, or reorganized. Employees do not know which priorities will quietly vanish next quarter. In this uncertainty, people look for signals that help them orient themselves. Who is trusted? Who is protected? Who is blamed? Who is ignored? Over time, these observations form a working map of the organization that is far more accurate than any formal diagram. Once this map exists, behavior shifts. People stop asking only, "What is the right thing to do?" and begin asking, often without conscious awareness, "Who will this attach me to? And what story will this create about me?" A well-reasoned idea that embarrasses a powerful person becomes dangerous. A mediocre proposal that reinforces an existing narrative becomes safe. Silence, agreement, and strategic ambiguity emerge not as moral failures, but as tools for navigating uncertainty. This is not corruption, it is adaptation. When outcomes depend on perception, people learn to manage perception. They learn which achievements to emphasize and which to downplay. They align their language with dominant themes. They distance themselves from projects that are losing political support and from colleagues who are becoming liabilities. None of this requires malice. It requires orientation. In an environment where futures are decided indirectly, people learn to watch not only the work, but each other. Over time, this creates a peculiar atmosphere. Everyone is paying attention to everyone else, not out of hostility, but out of the need to remain calibrated. Small shifts in tone matter. Changes in access are noted. Praise is interpreted. Silence is analyzed. The invisible game is not played consciously most of the time, but it is always being played. This dynamic explains why meetings often feel strangely disconnected from reality. In meetings, people are rarely just exchanging information. They are signaling loyalty, caution, competence, ambition, and alignment. A question can function as a challenge. A suggestion can signal dissent. A compliment can be an attempt at alliance. The literal content of what is said often matters less than how it reshapes relationships and narratives. What appears inefficient or performative is frequently strategic. From the outside, this can make organizations appear irrational. Projects continue long after it is clear they are failing. Bad decisions go unchallenged. Obvious problems remain unaddressed. From a purely operational perspective, this behavior makes little sense. From a political perspective, it makes perfect sense. Admitting failure creates blame. Blame creates vulnerability. Vulnerability attracts removal. Silence, by contrast, preserves position. The invisible game rewards those who understand this logic and quietly penalizes those who do not. New employees are particularly exposed because they arrive believing the official story. They focus on being useful, speaking honestly, and demonstrating initiative. In human terms, this is admirable. In political terms, it is risky. They do not yet know which opinions are safe to voice, which people are protected regardless of performance, and which projects are already dead but still officially alive. They offer clarity where ambiguity is preferred. They volunteer for work that will later be disowned. They assume that truth will be welcomed simply because it is true. Often, it is not. With time, most people adapt. They become more measured. They soften their language. They choose when to speak and when to remain quiet. Some interpret this shift as becoming compromised or inauthentic. In reality, it is the gradual recognition that the workplace is not a neutral environment governed solely by rules and reason. It is a negotiated space, shaped by risk, memory, and power. Understanding the invisible game does not require manipulation. It requires literacy. Just as you would not enter a foreign country without learning its customs, you cannot move safely through organizations without understanding how power, risk, and narrative operate inside them. Ignorance does not make you virtuous. It makes you vulnerable. Once you see the invisible game, outcomes stop feeling random. You may still dislike them. You may still disagree with them, but you no longer mistake them for accidents. That clarity does not grant control, but it does grant orientation. And orientation is the first step toward protecting yourself inside a system that was never designed to be fair, only stable. Chapter 3. Reputation is the currency. In the invisible game, money pays your salary, but reputation determines your future. Compensation keeps you present. Reputation decides whether you are trusted, protected, promoted, tolerated, or quietly removed. It is the medium through which all other judgments flow. Every organization maintains an informal ledger on every person inside it. This ledger is never written down, yet it is widely shared. It does not contain objective records or precise measurements. It contains impressions. Are you reliable or risky? Easy or difficult? Loyal or unpredictable? Rising or stagnant? These judgments form early, often within months, and once established, they change slowly. After that point, they stop reflecting behavior and start shaping how behavior is interpreted. No one is evaluated in isolation. Everyone is evaluated inside a story. Two people can make the same mistake and experience entirely different consequences depending on the narrative already attached to them. One is seen as having an off day. The other is seen as confirming a pattern. One is given the benefit of the doubt. The other is quietly downgraded. Over time, this gap widens, not because of a difference in performance, but because of a difference in expectation. Reputation does not merely record the past, it predicts the future, and then quietly arranges for that prediction to come true. This is why reputation exerts more force than metrics ever can. Most organizations like to believe they are meritocratic, and in narrow, mechanical ways they are. Work must be done. Results matter. Deadlines exist. But results never arrive unfiltered. They are interpreted, framed, and assigned meaning. A success can be credited to luck or to brilliance. A failure can be framed as learning or as incompetence. Once a reputation is in place, it decides which frame will be used, long before the facts are examined. Reputation also travels faster than you do. Long before you enter a room, someone has already told a story about you. It may be generous. It may be cautious. It may be quietly hostile. You may never hear this story directly, but you will feel its effects immediately. In how closely people listen, how readily they challenge you, and how strongly they advocate for you when you are not present. By the time you speak, you are rarely starting from zero. This is why organizational politics feels unfair to those who do not see it clearly. It is not that effort is meaningless. It is that effort does not speak for itself. Work does not announce its own value. People do. Stories do. Reputations do. Those who understand this do not only work hard, they are attentive to how their work is perceived. They ensure that their contributions are visible to the people who matter. They frame successes in language that aligns with existing priorities. They are cautious about attaching their name to failing initiatives, even when they are technically capable of saving them. They protect their reputation with the same seriousness that others reserve for protecting their income, because they understand that one ultimately governs the other. Those who do not understand this often become invisible. They produce high-quality work that no one connects to them. They solve problems quietly and then watch someone else receive credit. They are repeatedly assigned to failing projects because they are competent, and then blamed when those projects inevitably collapse. Over time, resentment builds. Confusion sets in. The rules they believed in appear to apply selectively, and no one explains why. Reputation also explains why people hesitate to speak up, even when they see something clearly wrong. Challenging a bad decision risks more than being incorrect. It risks being labeled difficult, negative, political. Once such a label attaches, it becomes the lens through which everything you say is interpreted. Even when you are right, you may be treated as the problem. Many people learn this lesson through painful experience, and once they do, they become quieter. In many workplaces, silence is not apathy, it is reputation management. This creates a subtle and persistent tragedy. Organizations require honest feedback to function, yet the people most capable of identifying problems are often the least willing to name them once their standing is at risk. The system drifts not because no one sees what is wrong, but because too many people understand the cost of being the one who says it. Understanding reputation as a form of currency changes how you move through the workplace. You become attentive not only to what your actions accomplish, but to how they will be interpreted. You think about who sees your work, not just whether it is completed. You listen for the stories circulating around you and notice how you are positioned within them. This is not about deception. It is about recognizing that meaning, not effort alone, determines outcomes. You cannot opt out of having a reputation, but once you understand how it functions, you can stop spending it blindly. Part 2. The Players. Chapter 4. Power Flows Through Networks. Power inside organizations does not reside where the organizational chart says it does. Titles, authority, and formal responsibility matter, but they do not explain how influence actually moves. Real power flows through relationships, through who speaks to whom, who trusts whom, who owes whom, and whose voice is consulted before a decision is publicly announced. Most people are taught to think of power as positional. They are encouraged to climb, to accumulate titles, to assume that proximity to authority guarantees influence. This belief is reinforced by formal structures, reporting lines, job descriptions, performance frameworks. These structures are real, but they are not decisive. They define responsibility. They do not define control. Every workplace operates through two overlapping structures. One is visible and official: departments, managers, procedures, and documented roles. This structure keeps the organization legible and administratively functional. The other structure is informal and largely invisible: alliances, reputational hubs, trusted intermediaries, and private channels of communication. The first structure allows the organization to exist on paper. The second determines how it actually behaves. When something consequential occurs, a promotion, a reorganization, a firing, a shift in strategic direction, it rarely begins in a formal meeting. It begins in conversations. Someone raises a possibility in passing. Someone else reacts cautiously. A third person offers support or warning. Concerns are tested. Reassurance is sought. By the time the issue reaches a formal forum, the range of acceptable outcomes has often already narrowed. The meeting does not decide, it ratifies. This is why meetings frequently feel scripted. People speak as if they are thinking aloud, but most of the thinking has already happened elsewhere. The room becomes a stage where pre-aligned positions are performed. Those who are not part of the underlying network are invited to observe and occasionally comment, but rarely to redirect the outcome. Participation is permitted. Influence is not. This dynamic is not evidence of moral failure or deliberate exclusion. It is a response to risk. In uncertain environments, coordination is dangerous. Public disagreement creates exposure. Premature commitment creates accountability. To manage this, people rely on trusted relationships. They test ideas privately before exposing them publicly. They seek confirmation before acting. Over time, these private trust loops solidify into informal power structures. Those inside them gain influence. Those outside them become peripheral, regardless of formal rank. Networks also determine how reputation spreads and hardens. Your manager's opinion of you matters, but your manager's manager's opinion matters more. So does the judgment of the people they trust. Praise from the wrong person carries limited weight. Quiet approval from the right one can be decisive. Criticism from a marginal actor is survivable. Disapproval from a central node can stall or end a career without any formal action being taken. This is why some individuals appear untouchable. They are not always the most competent or productive. They are well connected. They are embedded in key conversations. They are familiar, trusted quantities to people with influence. When problems arise, protection begins informally, long before any official process is triggered. Explanations are softened. Alternatives are found. Narratives are redirected. Those without networks experience the opposite reality. When something goes wrong, they face it alone. There is no one quietly reframing events in their favor, no one reminding others of past contributions, no one slowing the rush toward blame. The narrative hardens quickly, and once it does, recovery becomes difficult, sometimes impossible. Most people are taught to build skills. Few are taught to build position. Position is not flattery, manipulation, or self-promotion. It is placement within the flow of information and trust. It is being someone whose perspective is sought before decisions are made, not after. It is being remembered when opportunities emerge. It is being defended when interpretations turn hostile. Position determines whether you are inside the conversation that matters or reacting to decisions already made. You do not achieve this through visibility alone. Visibility without trust is exposure. Position is built by becoming useful to the network that holds power. This means solving problems that matter to influential people, reducing their risk, making their lives easier, and avoiding public embarrassment. Trust grows not from brilliance, but from reliability aligned with shared interests. Once this becomes visible, many confusing organizational patterns stop appearing mysterious. Why mediocre people rise, why talented people stall, why bad ideas persist, why good ideas disappear without debate. These outcomes are not filtered by truth or merit first. They are filtered by network compatibility. If you want to move through organizations without being crushed by them, you must stop imagining power as a ladder and start seeing it as a web. And once you see the web, you must decide consciously where you intend to sit within it. Chapter 5. Reputation is a currency. In organizations, reputation functions much like money. It is accumulated gradually, spent strategically, invested for future return, hoarded for protection, and in some cases, destroyed in a single moment. People often speak about reputation casually, as if it were a vague matter of being liked or respected. That understanding is shallow. In reality, reputation is not an emotion. It is a prediction. Your reputation is what others believe you will do under pressure, in ambiguity, and when something important is at stake. It is an expectation formed long before the moment arrives. The more predictable and reliable you are to those with power, the more valuable your reputation becomes. This predictability is not about obedience or brilliance. It is about whether your behavior reduces uncertainty or introduces it. This is why two people can produce identical work and experience radically different outcomes. One is perceived as dependable. The other is perceived as risky. The difference is rarely technical skill. It is narrative. One person's actions fit comfortably within an existing story about who they are. The other's actions trigger doubt, reinterpretation, or scrutiny because they do not. Reputation is not built through grand gestures. It is built through small signals accumulated over time. How you handle disagreement, how you respond to bad news, whether you protect others or expose them, whether you make problems smaller or larger by the time they reach leadership, whether you bring solutions or merely surface issues. Every interaction deposits into or withdraws from an invisible account. Most people are unaware they are making these transactions until the balance begins to matter. Once that account reaches a certain size, it starts to work on your behalf. Mistakes are forgiven. Delays are tolerated. Doubts are interpreted generously. When opportunities appear, your name is mentioned in rooms you are not in. You are not chosen because you argued for yourself. You are chosen because trust has already been established. The decision feels natural to those making it, even inevitable. When the account is empty, the opposite pattern emerges. Neutral actions are viewed suspiciously. Minor errors are escalated. Silence is interpreted as disengagement or avoidance. You are asked to justify yourself in ways others are not. You sense increased scrutiny because it is real. Your actions are no longer taken at face value. They are filtered through doubt. This is why reputation often outweighs performance in determining outcomes. Performance is episodic. It appears at specific moments, tied to deliverables and timelines. Reputation is continuous. It operates even when you are not present. It shapes how every new action is interpreted before anyone examines the details. By the time evidence is considered, meaning has often already been assigned. This also explains why public conflict is so dangerous inside organizations. When you argue openly, you are not just disputing an issue, you are generating narrative. Observers begin asking quiet questions. Who is difficult? Who is loyal? Who is safe? Who creates problems? Even when you are factually correct, you may lose reputational ground if you are perceived as disrupting coordination or increasing risk for those above you. Organizations consistently reward people who make life easier for those with authority. They punish those who introduce friction, even when that friction is justified. This creates a dilemma for intelligent, conscientious people. Speak plainly, and you risk being labeled sharp, arrogant, unstable, or political. Remain silent, and you risk becoming invisible. The solution is not dishonesty. It is narrative management. You choose when to be visible. You choose when to push and when to pause. You choose which battles grow your account and which quietly drain it. You learn that not every truth needs to be delivered immediately, publicly, or by you. This is not moral failure. It is economic reality. In a system where perception governs access to opportunity, reputation becomes the medium of exchange. You either learn how to accumulate it deliberately, or you spend your career paying full price for what others receive automatically. Once this becomes clear, another layer of the system reveals itself. Reputation is not merely personal, it is also political. And it is at that intersection, between personal standing and collective power, that the deeper games of organizational life truly begin. Chapter 6: Political Capital. Every workplace runs on two economies at the same time. One is visible and officially acknowledged. It consists of tasks, deadlines, metrics, deliverables, and performance reviews. This is the economy most people are trained to understand and optimize for. It is measurable, documentable, and easy to discuss. Alongside it operates a second economy, one that is rarely named but constantly felt. This economy is built out of loyalty, influence, favors, protection, and risk. It determines whose requests move quickly, whose mistakes are absorbed quietly, and whose problems receive immediate attention. This second economy is political capital. Political capital is the ability to get things done not because the system formally allows it, but because people make it happen. It is what permits some individuals to bypass procedures, survive errors that would end others, attract resources without asking publicly, and shape decisions long before they are officially announced. Where formal authority governs what is allowed, political capital governs what is possible. You accumulate political capital in ways similar to how you accumulate reputation, but with an added dimension. Reputation answers the question of how you are perceived. Political capital answers a more specific question: who benefits when you succeed? Competence alone is insufficient. You must be useful to someone with leverage. Skill creates capacity. Political capital creates permission. This is why people who solve the right problems advance faster than those who solve many problems. The right problem is not the most urgent, visible, or technically interesting one. It is the problem that removes pain from someone who has the ability to reward you. Executives remember who makes their lives easier. Managers protect those who reduce their exposure. Teams rally around those who shield them from blame or disruption. Help that travels upward compounds. Help that spreads evenly dissipates. Political capital flows upward, not outward. It attaches itself to individuals who absorb risk, translate chaos, and quietly prevent embarrassment. These contributions often go unnoticed by peers because they are designed to be invisible, but they are deeply noticed by those above because they change outcomes that matter. Fixing something before it becomes public is worth far more than fixing it after it has already created damage. This dynamic explains why certain people appear untouchable. They are not flawless. They are embedded. They have positioned themselves as structurally valuable to someone who matters. When conflict arises, the system bends to preserve them because losing them would be more costly than tolerating their shortcomings. Rules become flexible when assets are at stake. Once this becomes clear, it changes how you should behave. You stop trying to impress everyone. You stop chasing universal approval, which rarely translates into protection. Instead, you begin identifying where leverage actually resides. Who absorbs risk? Who makes final calls? Who influences those calls quietly? Then you orient your effort accordingly. This is not servility, it is alignment. You invest in relationships that amplify your influence rather than merely increasing your workload. You prioritize usefulness over visibility, reliability over brilliance, and discretion over performance theater. You begin to understand that effort directed toward the wrong audience is not neutral, it is wasted. Political capital also explains why injustices persist inside organizations. People with low capital are easy to discipline. They can be corrected, blamed, or removed with minimal resistance. People with high capital are negotiated with. Their behavior is contextualized. Exceptions are made. The same action produces different consequences depending on who commits it. This is not hypocrisy in the moral sense. It is asset protection in the systemic sense. If you want safety inside an organization, you do not look for fairness. Fairness is an abstraction. You look for entrenchment. You look for ways to make your presence costly to remove. Once you have political capital, you can afford a degree of honesty. Without it, honesty is dangerous because it creates friction without providing leverage. This is not cynicism. It is structural truth. And once you recognize this economy clearly, you are prepared to see the next layer beneath it. Because political capital, powerful as it is not the highest currency inside organizations. Control over narrative is. Part 3. The Mechanics of Office Power. Chapter 7. Narrative Control. Political capital allows you to survive inside an organization. Narrative control allows you to shape how that organization understands you. Every workplace runs on stories long before it runs on data. Before metrics are consulted or documents reviewed, judgments have already formed. Who is competent? Who is difficult? Who shows leadership potential? Who is a risk? Who is not a good fit? These conclusions rarely emerge from formal evaluation alone. They are produced through narrative. Narrative is how organizations compress complexity into something manageable. Human beings are too nuanced to be assessed in full. Their motives shift. Their performance fluctuates. Their behavior changes with context. The system cannot hold all of this at once, so it simplifies. It reduces people into roles, reputations, and shorthand descriptions that can be remembered, repeated, and acted upon. Narrative makes people legible. Once a narrative attaches to you, it begins to operate independently of your actual behavior. You are no longer judged on what you do in isolation. You are judged on what your actions are interpreted to mean within the existing story. Behavior does not speak for itself. It is translated. Two people can make the same mistake and experience entirely different outcomes, not because of the mistake itself, but because of the story already circulating about them. One is described as under pressure but reliable. The other is labeled careless and unstable. The same data produces two interpretations, and those interpretations create two different futures. This is why early impressions carry disproportionate weight. The first coherent story told about you becomes the reference point against which everything else is measured. Later behavior rarely replaces it. Instead, it is filtered through it. Success becomes luck. Failure becomes confirmation. Over time, the narrative feels increasingly objective, even as it drifts further from reality. Narrative control is not about deception. It is about refusing to let others define you before you do. People who rise quickly inside organizations tend to understand this intuitively. They manage narrative quietly rather than aggressively. They know which meetings generate perception and which do not. They know which stakeholders talk to one another. They understand when visibility helps and when it creates unnecessary exposure. They do not allow their identity to be shaped entirely by momentary frustration, rumor, or someone else's unresolved anxiety. They also understand something uncomfortable but essential. Most people inside organizations are not trying to be fair. They are trying to reduce uncertainty. Narrative is useful because it makes behavior predictable. Once someone is labeled, others know how to interact with them without expending energy. That efficiency is valuable to the system, even when the label is inaccurate. This is why narrative is so resistant to correction. Correcting a narrative forces the organization to reopen ambiguity. It must reconsider assumptions, reevaluate alliances, and revisit decisions that were already settled. That is costly. It is far easier to preserve the existing story and marginalize the person who no longer fits it. This is why attempts to explain yourself to a system that has already decided who you are often backfire. The more you argue, the more attention you draw to the narrative. The more emotion you display, the more material you provide. What feels like self-defense is often interpreted as confirmation. Narrative control therefore begins with restraint. You do not rush to defend yourself. You do not overshare. You do not perform innocence or transparency in the hope that clarity will save you. Instead, you allow your pattern of behavior to remain simple, consistent, and predictable. You give the system very little to work with. Over time, the story that forms around you becomes stable and uninteresting. That boredom is protective. The people most vulnerable inside organizations are not necessarily the quiet ones. They are the expressive ones. They reveal frustration, doubt, and complexity in environments that reward compression. The system takes that richness and condenses it into instability. Narrative control is therefore not about emotional honesty. It is about strategic legibility. You want others to know exactly what you represent, and no more than that. Everything beyond that boundary should remain undefined. Because in systems governed by story, what remains undefined is harder to attack, harder to distort, and harder to mobilize against. Once you understand narrative, another layer of power becomes visible. Because stories do not circulate on their own. They require carriers. They move through conversations, relationships, and trust loops. And that brings you to the next reality of organizational power. Narrative spread through networks. Chapter 8. Networks and Invisible Power. Most people assume that power in the workplace flows through titles and formal authority. They look at organizational charts and conclude that influence follows rank. In reality, this assumption fails almost immediately. Organizational charts describe who is allowed to decide in theory. They do not describe who actually shapes outcomes. The decisions that affect your career, your access to opportunity, and your long-term survival are rarely made by the person who technically outranks you. They are made by the people who speak to, advise, and influence those who outrank you. Every organization contains an invisible map layered over the formal one. This map is composed of relationships, trust, favors, grievances, and informal alliances that develop over time. It determines what information travels quickly and what information stalls. It determines whose voice is amplified and whose is ignored. It determines which mistakes are forgiven quietly and which become defining failures. If you do not perceive this map, you are not neutral within the system. You are operating blind. Inside networks, people rarely ask whether something is objectively correct. They ask who they trust and who they owe. Decisions are filtered through familiarity, history, and obligation long before they are filtered through logic. This is why competence alone does not protect you. A highly capable individual without allies is fragile because their survival depends entirely on formal evaluation and visible performance, both of which are unstable. An average individual embedded in strong networks is resilient because they are buffered by relationships that soften outcomes when conditions turn hostile. Networks provide forms of protection that no job description ever will. The first is early warning. People who are included in informal conversations hear about changes before they become official. They sense shifts in priorities, tone, and attitude while there is still time to adjust. They notice when their name begins to circulate and in what context. Those outside networks encounter danger only after it has already arrived, when narratives have hardened and options have narrowed. The second protection is cover. Networks act as narrative buffers. When something goes wrong, people with allies are not judged solely on outcomes. Their actions are explained, contextualized, and reframed. Responsibility is diffused. Time is bought. For those without allies, events arrive unfiltered. Context is ignored. Blame attaches quickly and becomes difficult to remove. The third protection is leverage. Networks operate on reciprocity rather than formal obligation. Favors accumulate quietly. Help is remembered. Advocacy creates expectation. When you have made yourself useful to others, reduced their burden, or supported them at key moments, they move on your behalf when you need it. These exchanges are rarely documented, but they are rarely forgotten. The system may not record them, but it enforces them nonetheless. This is why power inside organizations often feels unfair. It is not distributed by merit alone. It is distributed by connection. And connection is not built through being impressive. It is built through being useful, reliable, and emotionally safe. People promote those they feel comfortable with. They protect those who reduce their anxiety. They support those who do not threaten their position or identity. Once this becomes clear, behavior changes. You stop trying to win arguments in public forums where winning creates exposure rather than safety. You stop proving your intelligence to audiences that cannot reward it. Instead, you begin building quiet relational capital. This does not require becoming fake or manipulative. It requires recognizing that human beings are not spreadsheets. They are social organisms navigating uncertainty and risk. Power within a network grows through a small set of consistent behaviors. You make yourself easy to work with because low friction creates goodwill and preference. You become discreet because people trust those who do not leak, dramatize, or weaponize information. When you hear something sensitive and do not repeat it, your standing rises without announcement. You also solve small problems for powerful people, not by rescuing them or performing heroics, but by removing irritation from their day. Anticipating needs, translating complexity, and preventing minor embarrassments create memory and obligation over time. Gradually, this places you inside the stream of influence rather than outside it. You stop reacting to decisions after they are made and begin sensing them while they are still forming. You rely less on formal processes and more on informal alignment. Those who ignore networks are forced to depend entirely on rules and procedures. Those inside networks quietly shape how those rules are applied. This is not corruption. It is human reality operating within structured systems. Once you understand networks, many previously confusing outcomes become intelligible. You understand why some people are untouchable, why certain failures disappear without consequence, and why some careers stall despite obvious effort and ability. Power does not move in straight lines. It moves through people. And once you see the network clearly, another danger comes into view. Every network produces not only influence, but control points. Individuals who regulate access, information, and permission. These gatekeepers are the next force you must understand, because surviving networks is not the same as surviving those who control them. Chapter 9. Gatekeepers and Access. Once networks form inside an organization, gates inevitably appear. Every workplace develops informal choke points, individuals who sit between resources and those who seek them. These people may not hold the highest titles or attract the most attention, but they control access in ways that matter far more than formal rank. They regulate who reaches decision makers, which information travels upward, which opportunities circulate, and who receives protection when things go wrong. Gatekeepers are rarely appointed, they emerge. They are the assistant who filters a director's calendar and decides which requests are granted and which disappear. They are the project manager who determines what reaches leadership and how it is framed. They are the senior employee who knows how things really work and quietly advises others on what is safe. They are the colleague everyone checks with before acting. Power flows through these individuals because they reduce complexity for those above them. They screen noise, package reality, and spare leaders from overload. In doing so, they gain quiet authority. What a gatekeeper passes forward becomes reality. What a gatekeeper blocks effectively does not exist. This authority is rarely visible. Gatekeepers do not announce themselves or claim control. They accumulate influence through a series of small, routine decisions. Who gets a meeting? Who is copied on an email? Whose mistake is escalated? Whose request is delayed until it quietly dies? Over time, these micro-decisions shape careers, projects, and reputations without ever appearing in a formal record. To those outside the gate, outcomes feel confusing and arbitrary. Decisions seem to come from nowhere. Opportunities appear unevenly distributed. To those inside the gate, the logic feels obvious. They see what is being filtered, what is being softened, and what is being quietly discarded before it ever reaches visibility. This is where many careers fracture. People assume that strong work will naturally be seen. They assume that good ideas will find their way to the right ears. They assume that fairness exists somewhere higher in the hierarchy, waiting to be activated. Gatekeepers make these assumptions dangerous because they stand between effort and recognition. Gatekeepers do not operate on fairness. They operate on risk. Their calculations are simple, even if unspoken. Will passing this along create trouble for me? Will this person embarrass me or the person I serve? Will this upset someone I depend on? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, the gate closes. The decision is not moral. It is protective. Once you understand this, the way you move must change. You do not fight gatekeepers. You do not attempt to bypass them. You do not expose or confront them, because doing so only confirms that you are dangerous to carry. Instead, you align with them. You make their job easier. You reduce the risk involved in carrying your message forward. You become predictable, composed, and free of surprise. When you do this, access improves quietly. Your emails receive responses. Your ideas are floated rather than dismissed. Your presence becomes normal rather than intrusive. Nothing dramatic happens, but everything becomes smoother. Gatekeepers open doors not for those who demand entry, but for those who make passage safe. Most people sabotage themselves by pushing too hard, too loudly, or too directly at power. Gatekeepers read this behavior as volatility and shut the door in response. Those who move effectively through organizations understand that influence is always mediated. Nothing travels upward in its raw form. Everything is filtered, shaped, and framed by human judgment. Once you accept this reality, you stop wasting energy on frustration and begin investing it in relationships that actually move outcomes. You stop asking why the system is unfair and start learning how it operates. But gatekeeping has a darker dimension. The same structures that filter noise can also be used to shape reality itself. Information can be delayed, softened, distorted, or erased. Access can be granted selectively to produce desired outcomes. At this point, workplace politics stops being merely social navigation. It becomes narrative control. Chapter 10. Who controls the story? Once gatekeepers exist, stories inevitably follow. Every organization runs on narrative long before it runs on metrics. Long before performance is measured or outcomes are reviewed, quiet judgments are already circulating. Someone is described as reliable. Someone else is difficult. Another is brilliant but rough. Another is simply not leadership material. These labels move through meetings, emails, and informal conversations, shaping decisions far more powerfully than spreadsheets ever could. You do not compete inside data. You compete inside stories. A promotion is rarely granted because numbers align perfectly. It is granted because a coherent story about you has stabilized inside the minds of decision makers. That story determines how everything you do is interpreted going forward. The same action can be seen as initiative when performed by one person and as insubordination when performed by another. The difference is not the behavior. It is the narrative already attached to the person performing it. This is why workplace politics feels deeply unfair to those who do not see it clearly. People believe they are being judged on actions, when in reality they are being judged on consistency with an existing story. Once a narrative forms, it filters evidence automatically. Success confirms it. Failure proves it. Neutral information fades into irrelevance. Over time, the story begins to feel like fact. The most powerful individuals in any organization are not necessarily the ones who do the most work. They are the ones who control which stories survive. They decide what counts as a win and what counts as a problem. They determine which explanations are remembered and which are quietly discarded. In doing so, they shape the organization's collective memory. This control is rarely overt. It is exercised through framing. A missed deadline becomes either poor management or heroic overextension, depending on who frames it first. A conflict becomes toxic behavior or necessary leadership, depending on which narrative reaches authority earliest. The facts remain the same. The meaning changes completely. Speed matters here. The first version of a story to reach leadership usually wins. Once perception hardens, alternative explanations feel defensive or self-serving, even when they are accurate. Corrections arrive too late. Context sounds like excuse. This is why moments of crisis are especially dangerous. Ambiguity creates narrative vacuum, and vacuum is always filled. Whoever speaks first defines reality. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is surrender of narrative control. People who do not understand this dynamic lose control of their own reputations without realizing it. They assume that truth will speak for itself. It does not. Truth requires framing. If you do not describe your actions, intentions, and outcomes in a way the system can absorb, someone else will describe them for you, and they will not do so in your favor. This does not require dishonesty. It requires narration. You must learn to explain your work in the moral language of the organization. Every workplace has a value system, even when it pretends to be purely rational. Some environments reward stability. Others reward urgency. Some praise collaboration. Others quietly reward dominance. If you ignore this value system, your actions will be misread. If you understand it, your actions will be contextualized and protected. Those who fail to engage narrative are often described as confusing, inconsistent, or hard to place. Those who master it appear clear, reliable, and aligned, even when their behavior is identical. Protection follows coherence. Narrative control is not only defensive, it is also offensive. When someone becomes inconvenient, their story is adjusted rather than their behavior confronted. A once valued employee becomes hard to work with. A rival becomes political. A threat becomes unreliable. No single event marks the change. Only the frame shifts. Once it does, everything else follows naturally. This is how organizations remove people without formally removing them. Access shrinks. Support evaporates. Opportunities disappear. The person is not attacked directly. They are simply redefined. Understanding this makes one truth unavoidable. Skill matters. Effort matters. Competence matters. But none of them matter as much as story. Because inside organizations, reality is not what happened. Reality is what people remember happening. And memory belongs to whoever controls the narrative. Part 4. The Traps. Chapter 11. How people get pushed out. Most people do not leave organizations because they are formally fired. They leave because they are narratively removed. By the time an exit occurs, the decision has usually already been made months earlier, not in a meeting or through a documented process, but inside a story that is quietly stabilized. A subtle shift begins to take place. The language used to describe the person changes. The tone of interactions cools. Feedback becomes vague rather than specific. Invitations stop arriving. Someone who was once central to conversations and decisions begins to feel peripheral. Nothing dramatic happens. That is precisely how the process works. Organizations rarely confront directly when power or stability is at stake. Instead, they reposition. The individual is no longer described as a strong contributor or a valuable presence. They become someone who is not a culture fit, creating friction, or hard to manage. These phrases sound neutral and professional, but they are not. They are narrative signals. They indicate that permission to exclude has been quietly granted and that the system is preparing to move on. Once this story takes hold, every action the person takes is interpreted through it. If they push back, they are labeled defensive. If they remain quiet, they are seen as disengaged. If they work harder, they are accused of overcompensating. If they slow down, they are described as checking out. The range of acceptable behavior collapses. There is no correct move inside a hostile narrative because the outcome has already been decided and the interpretation simply follows. This is why people often feel trapped in the period just before they are pushed out. The harder they try to repair their position, the more they reinforce the very story that marks them as a problem. They sense that something has shifted but cannot name it. They feel watched, evaluated, and misread. What they do no longer matters on its own. It only matters as confirmation of a frame that no longer allows innocence. What triggers this narrative shift is rarely performance. It is almost always perceived threat. A person becomes dangerous when they disrupt an existing hierarchy, expose incompetence, refuse political alignment, or attract influence that bypasses formal authority. The organization may never articulate this explicitly, but it will register it instinctively. When someone stops being manageable, they become narratively unstable. That instability must be resolved. Rather than confront power dynamics directly, organizations reframe the individual. Once reframed, removal appears reasonable rather than political. Co-workers nod along. Managers agree. Human resources documents the narrative. A clean procedural ending is produced for something that was, at its core, about power and structure rather than behavior. This is why exits are so often described in moral language. People are said to be insufficiently collaborative, misaligned with values, or simply not the right fit. These phrases allow everyone involved to feel principled while avoiding a more uncomfortable truth. The person no longer served the structure as it existed. The story creates moral cover for a fundamentally political decision. The cruelest part of this process is that many people internalize the narrative that removes them. They assume they failed. They assume they were flawed. They assume they did something wrong. Sometimes they did. Often they did not. But by the time the exit occurs, the story is no longer about what actually happened. It is about what must be believed to justify the outcome. Understanding this changes how workplace exits should be interpreted. Not every departure is personal. Not every conflict is about behavior or competence. Many are about position and perceived threat. Those who remain are not always the most capable. They are the most narratively protected. And those who fall are not always wrong. They were simply placed in the wrong story. The next chapter explains how some people avoid this fate, not by being perfect or agreeable, but by becoming strategically unremovable. Chapter 12. How some people become untouchable. Every organization contains a small number of people who cannot be easily removed. They are not always the most talented, the most ethical, or even the most competent. What distinguishes them is not excellence but insulation. They are narratively anchored. Their continued presence is so woven into the organization's understanding of itself that removing them would require rewriting too many other stories at once. The cost of removal feels higher than the cost of tolerance. This is what protection looks like in practice. Untouchable individuals occupy positions that are structurally inconvenient to attack. They sit at intersections of information, relationships, and credit. They are associated, rightly or wrongly, with key successes that leadership relies on to explain past decisions and justify current structures. Their names appear in multiple narratives at once, reinforcing one another. To challenge them would mean destabilizing not just a person, but an entire web of meaning. When such individuals fail, the system reframes the failure. Context is added. External factors are emphasized. Responsibility is distributed. When they succeed, the success is amplified and attributed directly to them. The difference is not performance. It is narrative weight. Their story carries momentum, and momentum resists reversal. Many of these individuals understand something instinctively. Visibility by itself is not power, but visibility combined with indispensability is. They do not make themselves necessary by doing more work or working harder. They make themselves necessary by owning critical pathways. They become the person who knows how things really function, who maintains key relationships, who keeps processes from collapsing under pressure. Over time, they are described not in terms of tasks, but in terms of stability. Once this story takes hold, removal creates anxiety. Leaders begin to ask unspoken questions. What would happen without them? Who would absorb their responsibilities? Who would explain their absence to others? Rather than confront these uncertainties, the system chooses continuity. It keeps the person and absorbs the cost. Untouchable people also tend to avoid direct confrontation. They rarely challenge openly or escalate publicly. Instead, they influence quietly. They seed their interpretation of events early, before uncertainty hardens into blame. They build coalitions long before conflict becomes visible. By the time an issue reaches the surface, their framing has already shaped how it will be understood. This is not always the result of deliberate strategy. In many cases, it emerges organically from long tenure, deep institutional memory, or accumulated trust. But once narrative protection exists, its effects are the same regardless of intent. It functions as insulation. Others in the organization may have better ideas. Others may work harder or produce more. But they are replaceable. The protected are not. This distinction reshapes the environment over time. Competence becomes secondary to position. Merit becomes filtered through story. Those who do the operational work feel increasingly invisible, while those who manage narrative feel increasingly powerful. Most people do not consciously register that this shift has occurred. They continue to invest in effort, output, and correctness, assuming these will eventually be rewarded. They do not realize that the system has moved on to a different logic, one that prizes stability over improvement and coherence over truth. Understanding untouchability is not about imitating it. It is about seeing the game you are inside. Once you recognize how narrative protection operates, you can make an informed choice. You can attempt to build insulation for yourself. You can learn to work around it. Or you can decide that you do not want to play that game at all. The next chapter examines what happens to those who remain naive about this structure, and why so many capable people burn out even when they continue to perform well. Chapter 13. Why good workers get burned. Burnout inside organizations is rarely caused by workload alone. It is caused by misaligned effort inside political systems. People who believe that work is rewarded by contribution enter institutions expecting a fair exchange. Effort in return for stability, competence in return for security, loyalty in return for advancement. For a time, this expectation appears to be confirmed. Tasks are completed, praise is given, responsibility increases. Then something subtle but decisive shifts. They begin to notice that the people advancing are not the ones carrying the most weight. They are the ones carrying the most narrative. Good workers become destabilizing inside political systems because they expose a contradiction the system prefers to keep quiet. Their output demonstrates that real value does not automatically translate into status. Their competence invites comparison. Their presence introduces an alternative metric, contribution, that the organization cannot fully acknowledge without undermining its existing hierarchy. This creates discomfort, not admiration. The system responds by adapting. It does not punish good workers directly. It does something more effective. It gives them more work. It gives them more responsibility. It gives them higher expectations and broader scope. What it does not give them is more protection. They become load-bearing. Their competence allows others to appear successful. Their reliability lets managers make promises. Their willingness to help fills structural gaps that should not exist. Over time, they are not rewarded for this dynamic. They are consumed by it. This is where burnout begins. Burnout is not simple exhaustion. It is exploitation without recognition. It is the psychological and physiological response to sustained effort that no longer produces safety or meaning. When energy stops translating into protection, the nervous system registers the imbalance. Motivation drops. Cynicism rises. Emotional withdrawal sets in. The body understands what the mind is slow to accept. The exchange is no longer fair. The cruel irony is that the more capable someone is, the more exposed they often become. They are trusted with everything and protected from nothing. They are indispensable in function and disposable in narrative. They hold systems together operationally while remaining politically vulnerable. At the same time, others advance who do less visible work, but more political work. They attend the right meetings. They speak the preferred language. They align with influential figures. Their output may be thin, but their positioning is dense. They are not rewarded for contribution. They are rewarded for coherence with the system's story. Good workers witness this and feel something fracture internally. Their frustration is not a failure of character or resilience. It is an accurate perception of misalignment. They are operating according to one logic inside a system governed by another. Burnout is often framed as an individual problem. Insufficient boundaries, poor self-care, lack of grit. This framing is convenient for institutions because it avoids examining structure. In reality, Burnout is frequently a signal of structural mismatch. A person oriented toward contribution has been placed inside a system oriented toward narrative management and control. No amount of mindfulness, rest, or resilience training resolves that mismatch. The solutions are structural rather than personal. There are only three viable paths. One is to learn the political game and adapt. Another is to deliberately limit exposure to the parts of the system that extract without protecting. The third is to leave. The next chapter explores how some people quietly learn the game, what that learning costs them, and why understanding power often comes with a personal transformation they did not initially intend. Chapter 14. How people learn the game. No one enters an organization intending to become political. Most people arrive wanting to do good work, build something useful, or earn a living without unnecessary conflict. They assume that politics is an optional layer, something external, something they can avoid by staying professional and focused. What they eventually discover is that politics is not an add-on. It is what naturally emerges whenever people depend on one another inside hierarchies where rewards are limited and unevenly distributed. Some people learn this slowly. They begin by noticing small inconsistencies. Effort does not always lead to protection. Competence does not always lead to advancement. They watch who gets promoted and who stalls. They observe who is forgiven for mistakes and who is quietly blamed. Patterns begin to appear. They feel the subtle punishment that follows honesty at the wrong moment, and the subtle reward that follows alignment with the right narrative. At first, this realization is disorienting. It creates confusion and moral discomfort. The rules they believed in no longer explain outcomes. Over time, however, confusion gives way to practicality. They begin to adjust. They soften their language. They stop saying certain things in public forums. They learn to frame their work in ways that fit prevailing expectations rather than challenge them. They notice which managers actually matter, which stories travel upward, and which truths die quietly before reaching visibility. This is how political intelligence is formed. It does not begin as manipulation. It begins as self-preservation. They learn that disagreement is safer in private conversations than in meetings. They learn that written records can be liabilities rather than safeguards. They learn that praise travels farther than warning, that credit must be managed carefully, and that proximity to power often matters more than proximity to work. These lessons are not immoral. They are adaptive responses to an environment that rewards predictability and punishes surprise. But something subtle changes once a person becomes fluent in the game. Their way of seeing shifts. They begin to see people less as individuals and more as positions within a structure. They stop asking whether something is true and start asking whether it is safe to say. They stop asking what should be done and start asking who will be blamed if it goes wrong. This shift alters behavior. They become more cautious, more strategic, harder to read. They stop volunteering for tasks that do not convert into protection. They begin investing time and energy into relationships rather than outcomes. Over time, their work style changes. Contribution becomes secondary to survivability. What matters is not whether something improves the system, but whether it destabilizes their standing within it. People respond to this realization in different ways. Some become skilled navigators who move carefully and efficiently through power structures. Some become quiet manipulators who learn to shape outcomes without being seen. Some grow cynical and detached. Others simply become careful, limiting exposure and risk wherever possible. Very few remain innocent in the sense they once were. This transformation is not corruption in the simplistic cartoon sense. It is what happens when a human nervous system realizes it is operating inside a political ecosystem. Awareness replaces naivete. Strategy replaces spontaneity. You either develop political awareness or you become prey to those who already have it. The next chapter examines the cost of this transformation, what people lose when they master the game, and why many eventually regret the fluency they worked so hard to acquire. Part 5. Survival Strategy. Chapter 15. What politics does to people. Political environments do not merely shape outcomes. They reshape personalities. Once a person has learned the game, Work is no longer experienced as a space for creation or contribution. It becomes a space of exposure. Every action is assessed not only for competence, but for risk. Every conversation carries potential consequence. Every silence invites interpretation. The workplace stops feeling neutral and begins to feel watchful. This shift alters how people think and communicate. They stop speaking in straight lines and start speaking in buffers. Statements become qualified. Opinions are implied rather than stated. Language is designed to leave room for retreat. People learn how to sound agreeable without committing, how to participate without revealing position. This is not dishonesty in the moral sense. It is defensive architecture built to survive uncertainty. Over time, this posture becomes internalized. People begin editing themselves before anyone else needs to. They anticipate reactions, filter thoughts, soften edges, and trim truth until it feels safe enough to release. What begins as a tactical adjustment gradually becomes habitual. The boundary between strategy and self starts to blur. The cost of this transformation is subtle, but it accumulates. Clarity is usually the first thing to go. Conviction follows. Identity erodes last. People may continue to function well, even excel, but they begin to feel hollow. They achieve status, compensation, or recognition, yet remain tense and alert. They cannot fully relax because they are never fully off stage. There is always an audience, real or imagined. This produces a peculiar form of exhaustion. It is not the fatigue that comes from hard work or long hours. It is the exhaustion of constant self-management, maintaining the right tone, monitoring perception, adjusting presentation, managing exposure. The effort never ends because the threat is never formally removed. People respond to this pressure in different ways. Some cope by becoming emotionally numb, reducing investment to avoid pain. Some become cynical, treating everything as a transaction. Some become ruthless, embracing the game and discarding restraint. Others become invisible, minimizing presence to avoid risk. Very few manage to remain fully human inside prolonged political environments. This is why so many people who appear to win in organizations feel privately diminished. They gained leverage but lost alignment. They gained protection but lost coherence. Over time, they struggle to distinguish which parts of themselves are genuine and which are tactical adaptations. The person they perform as at work begins to bleed into the person they are everywhere else. The next chapter explains why this transformation is not accidental. It examines how political systems actively select for this behavior, why such environments reward it structurally, and why so many decent, capable people end up playing games they once believed they would never tolerate. Chapter 16. Why political systems select the wrong people. Political environments do not reward what is true. They reward what is safe. They do not elevate the people who see clearly or speak precisely. They elevate the people who create the least friction. This is the central paradox of organizational politics. The individuals most capable of improving the system are often the most threatening to it, while the individuals who protect the system's stability are often the least capable of changing it. This outcome is rarely the result of conscious design. Organizations do not sit down and decide to promote mediocrity or suppress insight. The process is evolutionary rather than intentional. Every organization carries internal risks: conflict, exposure, liability, instability, and loss of control. Political behavior functions as an immune system that reacts to these threats. Over time, the system begins to favor individuals who are skilled at reducing visible risk rather than those who create genuine value. The people who thrive in such environments tend to share a recognizable pattern of traits. They are agreeable toward those above them and cautious toward those below. They speak in generalities rather than specifics. They avoid clean commitments that could later be used against them. They escalate problems slowly, if at all. They take credit carefully and distribute blame broadly. They rarely make enemies, but they also rarely make decisions. None of these traits are admirable in isolation, but together they are survivable. They keep political temperature low, minimize disruption, and preserve narrative continuity. By contrast, people who speak plainly, identify flaws, or propose meaningful change generate heat. They introduce contrast. They force clarity. They make someone uncomfortable, even when they are correct. And discomfort is perceived as risk. As a result, the system gradually filters these people out, not always through formal termination, but through quieter mechanisms. They are sidelined. They are exhausted. They are marginalized. They are excluded from influence while remaining technically employed. The result of this process is predictable. Leadership fills with individuals who do not threaten leadership. Management fills with people who do not create waves. Decision-making slows while signaling accelerates. Meetings multiply. Language becomes vague. Activity increases while effectiveness declines. The organization begins to look busy while becoming increasingly hollow. This is why dysfunction can persist even when nearly everyone privately recognizes it. The people most capable of fixing the problems are denied leverage. The people with leverage are rewarded for not fixing them. Stability is preserved at the expense of progress, and the system congratulates itself for remaining intact. The system is not broken. It is doing exactly what it is designed to do: protect itself. Once this becomes clear, the way you move must change. You stop asking why the best people are not promoted, and you start asking who is safest for the story the organization needs to tell itself. You stop expecting truth to carry weight on its own, and you begin observing how risk is distributed and avoided. The next chapter examines how this dynamic turns meetings, emails, and daily work into a battlefield of subtle positioning, and how to navigate that terrain without being slowly crushed by it. Chapter 17. The Theater of Meetings. Meetings are where organizational reality is publicly performed. What happens inside them matters far less than what those actions signal. Decisions are rarely made in meetings themselves. They are staged there, presented as conclusions rather than explored as questions. The visible exchange is not the work. The real work happens beneath it. The primary function of meetings is not problem solving. It is alignment checking. Beneath the surface of every agenda item, participants are silently assessing the same things. Who is safe? Who is dangerous? Who is rising? Who is losing ground? Every sentence, pause, and reaction is interpreted through this lens, whether anyone admits it or not. As a result, people speak less to clarify and more to position. Questions are asked not to learn but to mark territory. Agreements are offered not because conviction has been reached, but because disagreement carries cost. Silence is calculated. Enthusiasm is rationed. The meeting becomes a social instrument rather than a cognitive one. This is why meetings feel disorienting when you speak honestly inside them. You feel slightly out of phase, as though you are operating on a different frequency from everyone else in the room. That sensation is accurate. You are speaking the language of substance in an environment that is operating in the language of survival. The mismatch is not intellectual, it is political. In such environments, what you say matters less than when you say it, who hears it, and how it alters the perceived balance of authority. A sharp, accurate insight delivered at the wrong moment can damage you by creating friction or embarrassment. A vague, non-committal comment delivered at the right moment can elevate you by signaling alignment. Timing outweighs truth. Framing outweighs precision. Meetings therefore function as visibility rituals. Who is invited and who is excluded signals rank. Who is allowed to speak without interruption signals authority. Who others defer to, who summarizes the discussion, and who closes the meeting all communicate status more clearly than any org chart. These patterns repeat, and repetition hardens them into fact. This is why interruptions sting more than open disagreement. An interruption is a status move. It communicates that one person's time, attention, and contribution matter more than another's. Silence, especially after a contribution, is read as weakness. Over-explaining is interpreted as insecurity. Concise certainty, even when unsupported, is often read as confidence and power regardless of content. Once you recognize this, meetings become legible rather than confusing. You begin to see why certain individuals dominate conversations without adding value. You understand why others are ignored even when they are correct. You notice why the same voices resurface repeatedly while others fade. These outcomes are not accidents. They are produced by the structure of the stage. Meetings are not neutral spaces for collective reasoning. They are theaters. And like all theaters, they reward performers who understand the role they are expected to play. The next chapter examines how email, messaging platforms, and documentation extend this same theater into slower, more permanent forms, where every word lingers and every misstep becomes harder to erase. Chapter 18. Email is a battlefield. If meetings are theater, email is litigation. Everything written becomes evidence. Everything forwarded becomes a potential weapon. Everything archived becomes a future risk. Most people approach email as a tool for communication. Power-aware actors treat it as a tool for positioning, record-keeping, and control. This is why email feels heavier than conversation. It is slower, colder, and permanent. It strips away tone and replaces it with interpretation. It creates records that survive context, intention, and memory. A sentence written quickly, without calculation, can be repurposed months later by someone who was never part of the original exchange, in a situation you never anticipated. In political organizations, email is rarely used simply to convey information. It is used to construct narratives. People copy others not for transparency, but to establish witnesses. They phrase sentences carefully to assign responsibility without naming it directly. They ask questions that sound neutral, but quietly create liability. They summarize discussions selectively, so that the written record favors their version of events. An email that reads, "Just to confirm you approved this," is not seeking clarity. It is manufacturing a document that transfers risk. This is why silence in email is dangerous. In many organizations, non-response is interpreted as consent. The system treats what goes unchallenged as accepted. What you do not correct becomes part of the record. At the same time, what you respond to becomes something you partially own. The act of replying pulls you into the narrative whether you intend it or not. This creates a narrow and uncomfortable corridor of action. If you respond emotionally, you appear unstable. If you respond defensively, you appear guilty. If you respond at length, you create material that can be excerpted, reframed, or used against you. If you do not respond at all, others are free to speak on your behalf. Each option carries risk. The effective posture in email is controlled minimalism. You say just enough to establish your position and no more. You avoid unnecessary detail. You do not volunteer narrative. You correct only what must be corrected to prevent misattribution or future distortion. You choose precision over completeness, clarity over catharsis. Email is not where arguments are won. It is where future losses are prevented. Those who understand this pay close attention to tone. In email, tone often matters more than content. A calm, neutral sentence can quietly reposition responsibility. A polite acknowledgement can remove someone from authority without confrontation. A short reply can reframe an entire thread simply by what it confirms or omits. The power lies not in what is said loudly, but in what is recorded cleanly. People who write emails as if they were private conversations are consistently outmaneuvered by those who treat email as a public ledger. The correct assumption is always the same. Anything you write may be read by someone you did not intend, at a time you cannot predict, for a purpose you did not choose. Once that assumption is internalized, language tightens, emotion recedes, strategy replaces spontaneity. The next chapter examines the most dangerous convergence of all, where documentation, meetings, and reputation collide. Performance reviews, evaluations, and promotion decisions, where narratives become official and consequences become irreversible. Part 6. Power. Chapter 19. Performance reviews are political trials. Performance reviews are not primarily about performance. They are about narrative. They exist to formalize stories that have already been circulating quietly for months, sometimes longer. By the time you sit in the room, the outcome is often already settled. The review is not a hearing where evidence is weighed and conclusions are reached. It is a ratification of conclusions that have already been drawn elsewhere. This is why people are often shocked by negative reviews they didn't see coming. They believed evaluation happened at the table, during the conversation, through the form. In reality, the real assessment occurred long before that moment, inside conversations, private emails, meetings they were not invited to, and impressions they never heard voiced. They were preparing for the wrong arena. Performance is only one input into this process, and frequently not the decisive one. Visibility, likability, narrative fit, and perceived loyalty often carry more weight than output. Most organizations do not promote the most capable individuals. They promote the least risky ones. The person who seems easiest to manage, easiest to explain upward, and least likely to create friction is often chosen over the person who creates the most value but introduces uncertainty. Seen this way, reviews are less about measuring contribution and more about assessing containment. Leadership is not only asking whether you perform, it is asking whether you can be controlled, whether you can be trusted not to disrupt existing structures, and whether you can be described to higher authority without embarrassment. The question is not, are you good? It is, are you safe? This is why feedback in reviews is so often vague. Precision creates liability. Specific claims can be challenged, contradicted, or disproven. Vague language preserves flexibility. A phrase like, needs to improve communication, can be stretched to mean almost anything later if circumstances require it. It becomes narrative clay, easily reshaped to justify future decisions. Once a narrative enters your formal record, it begins to harden. Every future interaction is filtered through it. Neutral actions are reinterpreted with suspicion. Small mistakes are taken as confirmation. Successes are minimized, reframed as luck, timing, or collective effort. The story no longer needs to be proven. It simply needs to be maintained. This is why arguing during a performance review is often fatal. You are not disputing a fact. You are challenging a story that already has support behind it. What feels like self-defense is perceived as resistance. What feels like clarification is interpreted as instability. The system is not listening for truth. It is listening for coherence. The effective response is not emotional defense. It is narrative calibration. You must learn to influence how you are described when you are not present. You must give others language they can safely use when they talk about you upward. You must make it easy for your manager to advocate for you without taking risk. In practical terms, this means framing your work, your decisions, and even your limitations in ways that fit the organization's preferred story. This is uncomfortable because it feels political. It is. Ignoring this reality does not make it go away. It simply guarantees that others will write your story without your input. Silence does not preserve neutrality. It forfeits authorship. The next chapter reveals how promotions actually happen, why they rarely hinge on merit alone, and how narrative, timing, and protection determine who moves up and who remains in place. Chapter 20. How promotions really happen. Promotions are not rewards for past performance. They are investments in future risk management. An organization promotes someone when it believes that person will make life easier for those above them. Not better, easier. Fewer problems to manage, fewer surprises to explain, fewer political risks to absorb. Promotion is less a recognition of excellence than a bet on containment. Skill matters in this process, but only when it is paired with narrative safety. The person being promoted must be explainable upward. They must fit the story leadership wants to tell about itself and its decisions. They must not threaten existing hierarchies, expose incompetence, or attract a level of attention that invites scrutiny. A promotable candidate is not one who sees clearly, but one who can be trusted not to create discomfort. This is why high performers so often stall. Their competence makes managers look replaceable. Their clarity reveals inefficiencies. Their output attracts attention that leadership may not want. None of this is safe. As a result, organizations frequently advance people who are competent enough to function, loyal enough to align, and quiet enough not to disrupt. These individuals become buffers between leadership and reality, absorbing friction rather than generating insight. The promotion process therefore rewards three consistent traits. The first is predictability. You behave as expected and rarely surprise anyone above you. The second is alignment. You reinforce the dominant narrative rather than challenge it. The third is containment. You do not destabilize others or introduce uncertainty into the system. These traits do not signal brilliance, but they signal safety, and safety is what promotions purchase. Once someone is perceived as promotable, the system begins working in their favor. Their mistakes are contextualized and forgiven. Their gaps are explained away. When someone is not seen as promotable, the opposite occurs. Their successes are discounted, reframed as situational, or attributed elsewhere. This divergence is not personal, it is structural. The narrative precedes the evaluation, not the other way around. Many people assume promotions are decided in meetings, through debate and evidence. In reality, they are decided in memory. Leaders ask themselves quiet questions long before any formal discussion takes place. Who is easy to defend? Who feels safe to elevate? Who will not embarrass me later? By the time the conversation becomes official, the decision already feels obvious. This is also why trying to prove yourself through overwork rarely produces advancement. Overwork increases usefulness, not promotability. It makes you indispensable where you are, not desirable somewhere else. You become too valuable to move and too exposed to promote. Effort without narrative repositioning traps rather than elevates. To rise, a person often has to become strategically boring, reliable, legible, non-threatening, easy to frame as leadership material. This does not mean becoming incompetent or disengaged. It means understanding that advancement is about how safely you can be placed into a story, not how much weight you can carry. The next chapter explores what happens when people recognize this reality and begin to perform strategically, and how that awareness transforms organizations into environments of mirrors, masks, and carefully managed appearances. Chapter 21. The Performance Layer. Once people realize that competence alone does not move them, behavior begins to shift. They stop focusing exclusively on doing the job and start paying attention to how the job is seen. Gradually, work turns into performance. The role matters as much as the result, and sometimes more. This is the point at which organizations begin to resemble theaters. Meetings become stages. Emails become scripts. Body language, tone, responsiveness, and visibility are read as carefully as output. People learn when to speak and when to remain silent, when to appear busy and when to appear aligned, when to show initiative and when to defer. The substance of the work remains, but it is no longer sufficient on its own. This performance layer is not inherently fake, it is adaptive. In a system that rewards narrative safety more than raw truth, survival depends on becoming legible within the dominant story. People learn what kind of employee is valued in their environment. The loyal one, the upbeat one, the tireless one, the fixer, the peacemaker, the problem solver who never creates discomfort. Once this template is clear, they exaggerate those traits and conceal everything else. Over time, authenticity erodes quietly. Individuals present curated versions of themselves that fit expectations. Doubt is hidden. Ambivalence is suppressed. Complexity is trimmed away. Soon, no one knows who anyone really is, because everyone is playing a role shaped by what the system rewards rather than by who they are. This is why workplace politics feels exhausting, even in the absence of overt hostility. People are constantly scanning for microsignals. Who is being promoted? Who is being sidelined? Who has lost access? Who is suddenly being praised? Every interaction carries two layers simultaneously: what is being said and what is being signaled. Listening requires interpretation. Speaking requires calculation. The tragedy of this environment is that the more people perform, the less real information circulates. Bad news is softened until it loses urgency. Risks are buried beneath optimism. Disagreements are avoided rather than explored. Leaders are protected from reality by the very performances designed to keep people safe. As a result, organizations drift. Decisions are made on the basis of staged confidence rather than ground truth. And when failure finally arrives, it feels sudden, even though the warning signs were present all along. Those who refuse to perform often find themselves isolated, not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt the script. They introduce unpredictability into a system that values smoothness. Their presence makes others uncomfortable, not because of malice, but because it threatens the coherence of the shared performance. This chapter does not argue for becoming fake or cynical. It argues for understanding the stage you are standing on. Awareness does not require imitation, but ignorance guarantees vulnerability. The next chapter examines how alliances form within this performative environment, and why loyalty is often negotiated and traded long before it is ever declared openly. Chapter 22. How alliances actually form. Alliances inside organizations are rarely built on friendship, shared values, or personal affection. They are built on mutual exposure. People align themselves with those who can protect them, validate their standing, or absorb risk on their behalf. Just as reliably, they distance themselves from those who create visibility they cannot control or danger they cannot manage. This is why alliances form quietly and long before they are ever visible. Two managers who share a weakness learn to protect one another. Two colleagues who hold damaging knowledge about each other develop a strong incentive not to betray it. Two people who depend on each other's silence gradually become close. These bonds are not necessarily emotional, but they are durable. This dynamic is not cynical, it is structural. In environments where mistakes are punished, narratives are fragile, and image determines survival, people seek buffers. They look for others who can shield them from blame, smooth over failures, or redirect attention when scrutiny becomes uncomfortable. Alliance is less about affinity and more about insulation. Once these bonds exist, information begins to flow through them. People inside alliances hear about reorganizations before they are announced. They learn about leadership changes while others are still guessing. They know which projects are effectively dead long before official cancellation. This asymmetry of information is not incidental. It is the substance of power. Those outside these networks are not uninformed because they are unimportant. They are uninformed because they are unprotected. Information travels where it is safe to land. It moves along paths where disclosure does not increase risk. Where there is no protection, there is silence. Formal hierarchy determines who signs documents and who appears accountable. Informal alliances determine who actually survives turbulence. This distinction explains why someone can be well-liked, competent, and even admired, yet still remain vulnerable. Niceness does not create coverage. Performance does not guarantee insulation. The strongest alliances are never announced or labeled. They operate through subtle preference. Who is invited into conversations? Who is defended when narratives turn hostile? Who is given second chances when others are not? Over time, these preferences harden into structure, even though no one names them as such. Once you see this clearly, the relevant question changes. You stop asking who your friends are. You stop asking who likes you. You begin asking a different, more diagnostic question. Who would lose something if I fell? Who would be exposed? Who would have to answer uncomfortable questions? Who would feel the impact of my removal? That is your real network. The next chapter examines how these alliances determine who absorbs blame when things go wrong, and why scapegoats are not accidents, but necessary stabilizers inside political systems. Chapter 23. Scapegoats and the Conservation of Power. Every organization eventually encounters failure. A target is missed. A project collapses. A public embarrassment occurs. Revenue drops. These events are not exceptional. What determines whether power survives is not the absence of failure, but how that failure is absorbed and redirected. Power preserves itself by managing pain. When something goes wrong, the system does not first ask what caused it. It asks who can carry it. Accountability is not distributed according to responsibility. It is distributed according to cost. A scapegoat is rarely chosen because they are truly guilty. They are chosen because they are available. Availability in this context means exposed, unsupported, weakly connected, or already marked as difficult. Scapegoats are people who cannot retaliate effectively. They lack allies who would intervene. They lack status that would provoke hesitation. They lack narrative control that would complicate the story. Blaming them costs the system nothing. At the same time, those who are genuinely responsible are often deeply embedded in protective alliances. Their failures are reframed as complexity, poor timing, or unavoidable external pressure. Their mistakes become lessons learned. The scapegoat's mistakes become unacceptable behavior. This difference is not hypocrisy in the moral sense. It is survival logic. Organizations preserve stability by sacrificing peripheral members to protect the core. That sacrifice performs several functions at once. It restores confidence. It signals accountability. It reassures observers that the system is in control. Leadership can say, "We handled it," without disturbing the structures that produced the failure in the first place. The scapegoat absorbs shame so the system does not have to. This is why scapegoating feels sudden and violent to those caught in it. One week a person is described as competent or reliable. The next week they are defined as the problem. Nothing about their actual performance necessarily changed. What changed was their usefulness as a shield. Once the system identifies someone who can absorb blame without resistance, the narrative shifts rapidly. After a person is marked, everything they have ever done is reread through the new frame. Past successes are minimized or forgotten. Ambiguous moments become evidence. Neutral behavior becomes suspicious. The story closes around them, leaving little room to maneuver. This is also why defending oneself so often fails. The narrative has already moved on. Counter-arguments arrive too late and sound self-serving. What feels like explanation is interpreted as denial. The system is no longer interested in accuracy. It is interested in resolution. The lesson here is not paranoia. It is positioning. Protection does not come from perfection. It comes from connection. You are safest not when you are flawless, but when your removal would create disruption for others. The most secure position in an organization is rarely the top. It is the middle of a web of people who would lose something if you were taken out. The next chapter examines how reputations are quietly shaped long before crises occur, and how certain individuals become scapegoatable well in advance of the moment when sacrifice is required. Chapter 24. How reputations are built before you need them. Reputation inside organizations is not a neutral summary of your work. It is a forecast of how dangerous you are likely to be to the system under stress. Long before any crisis appears, judgments are already forming about whether you are safe to blame, safe to ignore, or safe to protect. These judgments are rarely articulated directly. They are accumulated quietly, interaction by interaction, signal by signal. Every encounter deposits something into this assessment: how you speak in meetings, how you respond to pressure, whether you surface problems early or let them pass, whether you force clarity or tolerate ambiguity, whether you expose incompetence or quietly work around it, whether you avoid politics or refuse to play along. None of these behaviors are moral failings. Many are signs of integrity or competence. But inside a power system, they function as risk indicators. People who surface inconvenient truths, question prevailing narratives, or insist on precision are often valued in stable periods. They make systems more accurate. They prevent drift. But when stability is threatened, accuracy becomes less important than appearance. In those moments, the organization prefers individuals who protect image over those who protect truth. What once looked like rigor begins to look like danger. This is how reputations drift over time. Without any single dramatic event, someone slowly becomes described as difficult, not a team player, too intense, or not a cultural fit. These labels do not necessarily reflect performance or character. They reflect expendability. They indicate that the system has begun to classify the person as someone who can be sacrificed if necessary. At the same time, other individuals accumulate reputations that function as armor. They are described as reliable, low drama, good with leadership, or consistently positive. These labels do not mean they are more capable or more ethical. They mean they are predictable. They mean they reduce uncertainty for those above them. In a political system, predictability is protection. When a crisis eventually arrives, these reputations determine how damage is allocated. The organization does not conduct a careful search for truth. It reaches for narrative convenience. Who can be blamed without resistance? Who can be shielded without disruption? Who can be removed without cost? The answers to these questions were decided long before the crisis appeared. This is why people who are competent, ethical, and independent often fall first. They lack narrative protection. They have not accumulated the kind of reputational insulation that makes removal expensive. Meanwhile, mediocre but well-connected individuals drift upward or remain untouched, not because they excel, but because they are embedded. Their removal would create too many ripples. Reputation, in this sense, is not about admiration or popularity. It is about cost. It is about how expensive it would be for the system to discard you when pressure rises. Those who understand this early can shape their positioning long before they need protection. Those who do not often discover the truth only when it is too late. The next chapter examines how visibility itself becomes a liability, and why the people who work hardest and contribute most are often the most exposed when the system begins looking for someone to absorb risk. Chapter 25. Why visibility is dangerous. Most people assume that being seen inside an organization provides protection. They believe that visibility leads to recognition, recognition leads to security, and security leads to advancement. In practice, the opposite is often true. Visibility is not protection. Visibility is exposure. Inside organizations, the most visible people are usually the ones doing the most work. They solve the hardest problems, carry the most complexity, and step in when systems begin to strain. As a result, they leave the most fingerprints. Those fingerprints matter. They create traceability. Traceability creates evidence. And evidence, when pressure arrives, becomes blame. When everything is working, visibility produces praise. Names are mentioned. Contributions are highlighted. Competence is acknowledged. But when something breaks, the same visibility invites scrutiny. Questions begin to cluster around the most obvious figures. Attention turns into interrogation. The system looks for a place to anchor responsibility, and visible people provide convenient anchors. Power tends to prefer individuals who are useful but quiet. These are the people who keep systems functioning without being publicly identified as owners. They make things work without claiming credit. They fix problems without attaching their name to outcomes. If they disappear, the system continues to function. If they remain, they do not attract attention. These people are safe not because they are exceptional, but because they are replaceable without consequence. Highly visible performers, by contrast, become symbolic. Success is attached to them. They are held up as examples. Their identity becomes linked to outcomes. This linkage cuts both ways. When things go well, they are celebrated. When things go poorly, they become targets. Failure that would otherwise remain abstract is personalized through them. This is why organizations often burn out their strongest contributors first. These individuals are too visible to ignore and too isolated to protect. Their work makes others look effective. Their endurance allows dysfunction to persist. They absorb overload, ambiguity, and leadership failure quietly until they cannot anymore. When they finally collapse, the collapse is treated not as a systemic failure, but as a personal one. This pattern is not driven by cruelty. It is driven by efficiency. The system extracts maximum output while minimizing accountability. It benefits from the labor of highly visible workers while retaining the option to blame them if necessary. From the organization's perspective, this is a rational trade. The safest workers are not the most talented or the most productive. They are the most embedded. They are connected laterally as much as vertically. They are known, but not spotlighted. They are useful, but not singular. Their value is distributed across relationships rather than concentrated in visible ownership. This is also why self-promotion is dangerous when it is not paired with alliance. Drawing attention to yourself without protection does not elevate you. It marks you. Visibility without coverage increases risk rather than reducing it. The next chapter examines how informal power networks determine who survives when things go wrong, and why protection rarely comes from performance alone. Chapter 26. The Real Power Map. Every organization publishes an organizational chart. Almost none of them actually operate according to it. The chart exists to describe authority in theory, not to explain power in practice. The real map of influence is informal, undocumented, and learned only through experience. It consists of who talks to whom, who trusts whom, who protects whom, and who owes whom. These relationships determine what gets approved, who is blamed when things fail, and who is quietly spared when consequences are distributed. Formal authority sets rules. Informal power decides outcomes. A person can violate a rule and survive if the network covers them. Another can follow every rule precisely and still be removed if the network turns against them. This is why outsiders who perform well but fail to integrate socially are often stunned when they are suddenly blocked, sidelined, or pushed out. They believe performance is the game being played. It is not. Performance buys relevance. Relationships buy safety. The real power map operates across three overlapping layers. The first layer is information. This is about who knows what before it becomes official. Early knowledge confers advantage. It allows people to prepare, align, and protect themselves before decisions harden. Those outside this layer encounter change only after it has already become irreversible. The second layer is narrative. This concerns who controls how events are interpreted. Facts do not move on their own. They are framed, contextualized, softened, or sharpened, depending on who speaks first and who is believed. Narrative decides whether an event is remembered as a failure, a lesson, or a necessary compromise. It determines whether a person is seen as responsible, unlucky, or heroic under pressure. The third layer is protection. This is the most decisive layer of all. Protection determines who can prevent consequences from landing. When pressure rises, protection absorbs impact. It redirects blame, delays judgment, or dissolves scrutiny altogether. Without protection, even minor missteps can become terminal. People at the top of organizations rarely need to micromanage these dynamics. They sense them. They feel where trust is flowing, where alliances are forming, and where resistance is hardening. When something goes wrong, they do not begin by searching for objective truth. They look for where the network is leaning. If the network is already aligned against someone, that person is finished. Evidence becomes decorative rather than decisive. If the network is aligned behind someone, problems dissolve quietly or are reframed until they no longer threaten stability. This is why scandals inside organizations often feel arbitrary to observers. They are not judged by severity or harm. They are judged by isolation. A severe failure committed by a well-protected individual may be absorbed without consequence. A minor error committed by someone socially unanchored can trigger removal. The difference is not ethics. It is network position. The most dangerous place in any organization is not the bottom or the top. It is the position of being technically indispensable, but socially unanchored. Such a person carries visible responsibility without protection. They are known, but unsupported. They are relied upon, but not defended. When something must be sacrificed to restore stability, they become the obvious choice. In the next chapter, we examine how organizations manufacture narratives after the fact to justify these sacrifices, and how stories are constructed to make political decisions appear inevitable, reasonable, and fair. Chapter 27. How scapegoats are made. Scapegoats are not selected because they are guilty. They are selected because they are available. When an organization encounters failure, it must produce an explanation that preserves its own legitimacy. Systems are structurally incapable of admitting that they themselves are flawed. Instead, They locate fault in individuals. Blame becomes personalized so that the system can remain intact. The function of a scapegoat is not justice. It is closure. Someone must carry the story so the organization can move forward without reopening deeper questions. Uncertainty is intolerable to systems that depend on confidence and coordination. Naming a scapegoat provides resolution. It allows leadership to declare the matter handled and restores a sense of order. The people chosen for this role tend to share predictable traits. They are visible enough to be plausibly connected to the failure. They are associated with the work that went wrong. They lack strong protectors who would intervene on their behalf. And they are different enough from the core group to feel expendable. High performers with weak alliances are particularly attractive targets. So are newcomers, who have not yet accumulated protection. So are truth-tellers, whose accuracy has already made others uncomfortable. Once a scapegoat is identified, the narrative shifts rapidly. Past mistakes are reread as patterns. Ambiguous moments are reinterpreted as intent. Neutral behavior is cast as negligence. Any attempt to explain becomes proof of guilt. Facts lose relevance. What matters is not accuracy, but coherence. The story must make sense and feel complete. The organization experiences a palpable sense of relief once a scapegoat is named. Anxiety drops, tension dissolves, conflict resolves. The system stabilizes. This is why scapegoating often feels moral rather than brutal. It serves a psychological function. It restores equilibrium by channeling diffuse fear into a single manageable target. The tragedy is that removing the scapegoat rarely fixes the underlying problem. The structures that produce the failure remain unchanged. The incentives remain intact. The same conditions persist, now unexamined. Only the individual is gone. As a result, similar failures recur, and new scapegoats are eventually required. Those who understand this dynamic do not attempt to fight scapegoat narratives head-on. Direct resistance usually accelerates the process by confirming that the target is unstable or defiant. Instead, they focus on positioning. They make themselves difficult to isolate. They embed themselves within networks that would be disrupted by their removal. The next chapter explores how insulation can be built inside political systems without becoming cynical, manipulative, or morally compromised, and how protection can coexist with integrity rather than replacing it. Chapter 28: Insulation without corruption. In political environments, survival requires insulation. Insulation is not manipulation or deception. It is shock absorption. It creates distance between you and blame, between you and hostile narratives, and between you and sudden shifts in power. Without insulation, every mistake, delay, or conflict lands directly on you, with nothing to soften the impact. One of the most dangerous assumptions principled people make is believing that integrity alone provides protection. It does not. Integrity without structure is exposure. Ethics may govern how you act, but they do not determine how systems respond under pressure. When instability arises, protection flows toward those who are embedded, not those who are merely correct. Insulation is built through a small number of deliberate structural choices. The first is distributed value. You avoid becoming the single point of success or failure. You spread ownership across people and teams. You share credit openly. You allow others to be seen as essential to outcomes. This creates mutual dependency. When value is distributed, removing any one person becomes costly because it disrupts multiple narratives at once. The second is lateral alliances. Vertical loyalty is inherently unstable. Leaders change, priorities shift, and strategies are rewritten. Loyalty upward often expires without warning. Relationships built sideways endure longer. Peers remember who supported them, defended them, and reduced their risk. Lateral networks are harder to sever because they are not tied to a single authority figure. The third is narrative positioning. You are known for a role rather than a threat. You are seen as a solver, a stabilizer, a translator, someone useful to multiple groups rather than aligned with only one. When your identity inside the organization is flexible and broadly valuable, removal becomes complicated. Ambiguous roles are harder to attack because no single narrative can fully capture them. None of this requires dishonesty. It requires awareness. It is not about manipulating others or abandoning principles. It is about ensuring survivability in environments that do not reward purity. Systems do not protect people because they are admirable. They protect people because removal would be inconvenient. Those who refuse to build insulation are often respected in the abstract. They are described as principled, talented, or admirable. And then, when pressure rises, they are removed. The system does not act out of malice. It acts out of necessity. Without reasons to protect someone, it simply does not. The next chapter examines how power probes boundaries to discover who can be pushed, who will resist, and who is too costly to test, revealing the final layer of survival inside organizational politics. Chapter 29. Pressure testing power does not ask who you are. It observes what happens when you are under stress. In political systems, boundaries are not respected automatically. They are discovered through pressure. Every role, every individual, and every department is quietly tested to determine how much can be extracted before resistance appears. This process is not driven by cruelty. It is driven by optimization. Deadlines are shortened. Requests become deliberately vague. Responsibilities expand without formal acknowledgement. Accountability shifts subtly from one place to another. Each small increase in demand functions as a probe. Each concession establishes a new baseline. When pressure is accepted without response, it becomes permanent. When it is resisted, the system learns where the boundary lies. Most people misunderstand these moments. They assume they are being evaluated for competence or dedication. In reality, they are being evaluated for absorbency. The person who never pushes back becomes the container for everyone else's disorder. The person who reacts emotionally is marked as unstable. The person who responds with precision, calm, and limits becomes expensive to misuse. Pressure testing is how power maps terrain. This is why overperformance can be dangerous. If you solve every problem immediately without renegotiating scope or cost, the system concludes that your capacity is effectively infinite. That conclusion does not lead to reward. It leads to loading. More responsibility arrives, more ambiguity follows, and protection does not increase in parallel. Resistance in these environments does not require open conflict. It requires friction, a question that forces clarification, a request for prioritization, a pause that interrupts momentum, a renegotiation that introduces cost. These small acts compel the system to decide whether the demand is truly necessary. Many pressures evaporate as soon as they encounter even mild resistance because they were never essential. They were opportunistic. Those who survive organizational politics do not avoid pressure entirely. They make it costly. They respond in ways that impose effort on those applying it, without escalating into confrontation. Over time, the system learns that pushing on them yields diminishing returns and redirects pressure elsewhere. The final chapter addresses the deepest rule of all, the one beneath every pattern described so far: why people are rarely removed for being wrong, but are consistently removed for becoming unsafe to the structure that surrounds them. Chapter 30. Becoming non-removable. In political systems, people are rarely removed for incompetence. They are removed for disrupting stability. Stability does not mean truth, justice, or effectiveness. It means predictability, alignment, and control of risk. A person becomes dangerous not when they fail, but when they introduce uncertainty into how power operates. When leaders cannot predict whether you will comply, contain fallout, or absorb damage quietly, you become a variable. And systems are built to eliminate variables. People who become non-removable are not necessarily admired or liked. They are relied upon. Their value is structural rather than emotional. They occupy positions where multiple outcomes depend on their continued presence. They hold knowledge, relationships, or coordination functions that cannot be easily replicated. Removing them would not solve a problem. It would create several new ones at once. This status is not achieved by hoarding authority or demanding recognition. It is achieved by embedding yourself deeply into how things actually function. Non-removable people become part of the machinery. Their absence would cause friction across teams, processes, and narratives simultaneously, making removal more costly than tolerance. 3 traits consistently make someone difficult to remove. The first is irreplaceable context. These individuals understand processes, histories, and informal flows that are not written down anywhere. They know why things are the way they are, not just how they are supposed to work. They understand who speaks to whom, where decisions really form, and what quietly breaks when a particular piece is moved. This kind of knowledge cannot be transferred quickly, and the system hesitates to lose it. The second trait is cross-faction usefulness. Non-removable people are not tied exclusively to a single patron or camp. They are valuable to multiple sides at once. Different groups rely on them for different reasons. Because of this, removing them would force the organization to absorb resistance from several directions simultaneously. Tolerating them becomes the cheaper option. The third trait is low-drama reliability. These individuals do not generate noise. They do not provoke attention. They do not become narratives. They solve problems quietly, stabilize situations before they escalate, and allow others to take credit publicly. They reduce volatility rather than amplifying it. Over time, they become associated with continuity rather than disruption. People who chase visibility remain removable. Visibility concentrates narrative. Narrative concentrates blame. People who anchor systems diffuse both. They are not seen as singular contributors, but as connective tissue. The paradox of power is that the safest position is rarely the highest one. It is the most entangled one. When you are woven into how things work, you stop being evaluated primarily as a person. You begin to be treated as infrastructure. And infrastructure, once relied upon, is expensive to tear out. Epilogue. After the games. Office politics, workplace power, and organizational maneuvering are usually described as moral failures, as though the problem were simply that people are dishonest, selfish, or small. This way of seeing things is comforting because it allows us to believe that dysfunction is caused by bad actors rather than by structure. But it misses a deeper truth. Modern institutions are not primarily moral systems. They are coordination systems. Once enough people, money, reputation, and risk are packed into the same structure, behavior stops being about character and starts being about survival, alignment, and the control of uncertainty. What you have just read is not a handbook for becoming manipulative, nor a justification for cynicism. It is a map of how pressure actually flows when real stakes exist. Without such a map, even principled people are quietly conscripted into games they do not understand. They sacrifice time, credibility, and self-respect to systems that reward obedience more than honesty and stability more than truth, all while believing they are simply doing their jobs. The shift this book invites is not toward aggression or dominance, it is toward authorship. It is the shift from seeing yourself as a character trapped inside someone else's story to recognizing yourself as a structural actor with leverage, limits, and choices. That recognition changes how you move. You begin to understand when to absorb pressure and when to resist it, when alignment is strategic and when it is corrosive, when patience is wise and when departure is the only form of agency left. Power, in the end, is not about controlling others. It is about not being owned by forces you cannot see. It is about understanding the mechanisms that shape outcomes so you are not unconsciously shaped by them. Once you see how influence, narrative, pressure, and dependency actually operate inside organizations, exhaustion stops masquerading as loyalty. Chaos stops pretending to be necessity. You gain the clarity to decide what you will carry and what you will refuse. That clarity does not guarantee safety, success, or fairness, but it does offer something more durable. It allows you to remain intact inside systems that were never designed for your well-being, and to leave them, if you must, without mistaking survival for virtue or sacrifice for meaning. Written by Aaron Kairos, narrated by Arlen Vale.